Hi kids, we're going to read Unit 1, Lesson 3 in your Social Studies book. It is titled Ohio's Early People. So please get your Social Studies book and turn to page 28 so that you can follow along. You can pause the video if you need to go get your Social Studies book. What to know? How were the early people in Ohio affected by their environment? That's one of the things we're going to read about. Vocabulary words in this lesson include nomad, band, ancestor, prehistoric, adapt, culture, mound, and artifact. The people that are in this lesson are the Paleo Indians, the Archaic Indians, the Adena, Hopewell, and Fort Ancient Indians. And the place that we'll read about is the Sunwatch Indian Village. Lesson 3, Ohio's Early People. You are there. Shh, I see one, the hunter next to you whispers. Standing in the distance is a woolly mammoth. You're excited and a little scared. Lately, the large animals have been harder and harder to find. A successful hunt is important to your people. This mammoth will provide meat for many days. Its hide will provide warmth and shelter. Page 29. A long time ago. In the past, Earth had long periods of freezing cold. These periods are known as ice ages. During ice ages, much of Earth's water froze and became trapped in glaciers. As a result, the water level of the oceans dropped. At several times, a bridge of dry land appeared between Asia and what is now Alaska. Early people arrive. Over time, people from Asia began to cross the land bridge. Many scientists believe that this is how early people came to North America. These people were nomads, or people without a permanent home. They spent much of their time moving from place to place in search of food. The nomads who crossed the land bridge probably followed herds of animals. They hunted these animals for food and hides. Early people moved in bands or small family groups that lived and worked together. Over thousands of years, early people spread out over North and South America. They were the ancestors or early family members of present-day Native Americans. Native Americans are also called American Indians. This is the land route of the early people. The North Pole is up in here in the Arctic Ocean. This is Asia, and this is North America. So this area right here is between Asia and North America. Right now, there's water here between these two continents, but at some time in history, the water was trapped in ice during an ice age, and the land appeared. So people traveled from Asia here, across the land bridge, through what is now Alaska, down through Canada, and down into the United States of America. It wasn't called the United States of America back then. Some of the people even traveled all the way down into South America through this Isthmus of Panama right here and Central America. This key shows that the brown and light brown is land. White is where glaciers were. Sea ice is the light blue, so this is ocean, but it's frozen up around the Arctic and the North Pole. And the red lines are the routes that the people traveled. Turn the page. Page 30. Prehistoric Indians of Ohio. In the picture at the top, uncovering the past, this Adena arrowhead and the Paleo Indian artifacts found in Sheridan Cave, Wright, offer clues about early Ohio peoples. So some of the things that we have learned about the prehistoric people of Ohio come from artifacts that they have left behind. Prehistoric Indians of Ohio. About 12,000 years ago, early people reached what is now Ohio. These early people did not have written languages and left no written records of how they lived. People who lived before written history are sometimes known as prehistoric people. The Paleo Indians. The first people who lived in Ohio are called the Paleo Indians. They were nomads who hunted large animals for food. About 10,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. The climate became warmer and drier. The larger animals died out. People had to adapt or change their ways of life to survive. The Archaic Indians. After the last ice age, the Archaic Indians lived in Ohio. The Archaic Indians fished and hunted animals, including bison, white-tailed deer, and rabbits. They also ate plants and gathered nuts and berries. At first, the Archaic Indians lived as nomads. Over time, some settled in communities. They built wooden tents covered with bark or animal skins. They also began to store nuts and other foods for future use. The Archaic Indians made tools such as axes from stone. They also made spearheads from flint, a kind of stone. With stone tools, they were able to make canoes. Canoes allowed them to move people and goods by water. They traded flint with other groups for seashells and copper. Many groups of Archaic Indians developed similar beliefs. They spoke and dressed in the same way. Each group, however, had its own culture or way of life. Page 31. The Mound Builders. In the late 1800s, a farmer in southern Ohio found about 30 large mounds on his land. Mounds are piles of hard-packed earth and stone. Scientists discovered many artifacts or objects made by people in the past in the mounds. The artifacts included spearheads, beads, and jewelry. The people who built these and other mounds are often called mound builders. The earliest mound builders in Ohio were part of a larger group known as the Woodland Indians. The Woodland Indians thrived in Ohio about 3,000 years ago. They included two main groups, the Adena and the Hopewell. The Adena lived in southern Ohio in many of the same places as their ancestors, the Archaic Indians. The Adena lived in villages and grew squash and sunflowers. They also hunted, fished, and gathered fruits. The Adena were among the first people in Ohio to make pottery. They also used stone axes and hoes. The Adena used mounds for burials. When important leaders died, they were buried, and a mound was built over the site. As more people were buried, the mounds grew. The illustration at the bottom shows a picture of a Hopewell village. And this artifact right here is an image of a crow made out of copper. Some artwork that is made in the shape of a living thing we call an effigy. So this is an effigy of a crow. Hopewell. The Hopewell Indians lived in central and southern Ohio. Their culture grew from the Adena culture. Turn to page 32. Hopewell mounds were much larger than Adena mounds. Their mounds were also built in many shapes, such as circles, squares, and octagons. The Hopewell used their mounds for religious ceremonies and for social gatherings. The mounds were also used as trading centers. The Hopewell made objects from faraway resources, including copper and shells. They traded for many of these resources. In fact, their trade network stretched from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains and south to the Gulf of Mexico. Work in Hopewell villages was divided among the people. Each worker did a different job. This way of working, called division of labor, made it easier for the Hopewell to meet their needs. Fort Ancient Indians. The Fort Ancient Indians lived in villages in southern Ohio about 1,000 years ago. They were one of the last groups of prehistoric people in Ohio. These groups are known as the late prehistoric people. The late prehistoric Indians were like the woodland Indians in many ways. However, they were different in that they depended on farming for most of their food. Late prehistoric Indians grew large crops of squash, beans, and corn. And we're going to go to the next page before we talk about this picture. So go to page 33. The Fort Ancient Indians built villages with square or circle-shaped houses made from wooden poles. Visitors to Sunwatch Indian Village, right here in this picture, in Dayton, Ohio, can see how a Fort Ancient Indian village may have looked. The Fort Ancient Indians also built mounds. Some were shaped like animals. Many scientists believe that Serpent Mound in present-day Adams County was built by the Fort Ancient Indians. During this time, other prehistoric people lived in Ohio. They are called the Sandusky, the Whittlesey, and the Monongahela. There's a Monongahela River in Ohio as well. Like other groups, late prehistoric Indians shared similar ways of life. However, each group also developed its own culture. Now let's look back at the picture on page 32. This is a picture of the Serpent Mound. It is 1,348 feet long. In some areas, it is about 20 feet wide. This gray line right here is actually a sidewalk that goes all the way around the Serpent Mound. This is in a park, so you can go visit the Serpent Mound and you can walk on this path that goes all the way around the Serpent Mound. And this little shape right here is actually an observation tower. So you can climb up the steps to go to the top of the observation tower so that you can look out and you can see the whole Serpent Mound from the top of this observation tower. Page 33, summary. People first came to Ohio near the end of the last ice age. Over time, people began to settle in villages. They also learned to trade and to farm. Some groups built huge mounds. The mounds were used for burials, for ceremonies, and as social and trading centers. Early groups of people in Ohio shared similar ways of life. Down at the bottom are some review questions, which you can read to review this section. And then we're going to read about primary and secondary sources. Why it matters. People who study the past look for sources of information. These sources give information about what happened. A primary source is any record made by people who were present when an event took place. An example might be a letter, a diary, a book, or an interview. Drawings, paintings, and photographs can also be primary sources. A secondary source is a record made by people who were not there when an event took place. An encyclopedia is a secondary source. Written articles, paintings, and photographs made by people who did not see the event are also secondary sources. And here's some examples right here. A canoe that was actually made by Indians would be a primary source. A replica or a copy of a canoe made to look like canoes that were made by Indians would be a secondary source. A map of Ohio that was drawn in early times would be a primary source. But if it's a map that somebody drew recently to make it look like what it looked like back then, that would be a secondary source. If you have an artifact like, for instance, this copper effigy right here, the copper effigy of the crow. If it was the actual one that was made by Indians, that would be a primary source. This picture of it is a secondary source. So this first picture shows copper pots traded by Europeans to Native Americans. The second picture shows a Native American canoe. And the third picture shows an 1822 map of Ohio. And here's a practice activity that you can do about primary and secondary sources. I'm going to let you read this page on your own. Don't skip it. Still read it. And then I recommend that you go back and review these questions at the end of page 33, at the end of lesson 3.